Hi, everyone. We are here for, I think this is the final science seminar of the academic year in our institute. And we have a handful of folks who are at the sleep conference. So unfortunately, will not be able to attend, although Steve is somehow sneaking in or sneaking away from his meetings at the conference. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Larry Martinez. And Larry is a colleague of mine and a friend of mine from Portland State University. I worked very hard to recruit him there. Remember that, Larry?
Yep.
And worked closely with him and still work closely with him. We are actually currently working on the farm worker overtime project that I have mentioned to a number of folks. Dr. Martinez is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at PSU, and he earned his PhD in IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology from Rice University. His work is focused on inclusion, diversity, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination in the workplace. And in particular, he's focused on the experiences of traditionally underrepresented employees, including cancer survivors, transgender individuals, individuals with disabilities, and sexual orientation minorities. He uses a multitude of different methodologies in his research, and he also is doing quite a bit of applied work in the community. As he's devoted really to the community engagement and participatory research, and he also serves on a number of boards in the community. So it's a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and present to our institute, Larry. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Larry, and he's actually going to he has two different kind of ways of presenting, I guess, some information, and he's actually going to open it up a little bit in the middle for some Q&A, and then we'll have Q&A at the end as well. But I'll let him manage the timing of that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Larry. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. Yeah, what I'm presenting today is a project that I'm pretty proud of that I did. It's one of the first community engaged projects that I did when I moved to Portland. And the way that I'm presenting it is kind of, like Leslie said, there's a natural break in the middle, because what I'm going to present is the initial sort of findings that we presented to community stakeholders. So it's not as in depth in terms of like the theoretical aspect of things, but then after that, I'm going to sort of switch gears and go more into the more academic and scholarly aspects of what we think we found that is a little bit too high level, I think, for most of the community stakeholders. So you're kind of getting both sides of the story, I think. So what we're doing is looking at the experiences of people of color here in Portland, and what we've got, like I said before, is broken up into two sort of sections. And this is a project that I did in partnership with an organization here in Portland called Partners in Diversity. It's an affiliate of the Portland Business Alliance, and it's a nonprofit organization that their mission is to address, sort of the elephant in the room with respect to racial diversity in the Portland sort of metropolitan area. And they have a really systematic sort of programmatic way of doing that. So they have lots of different events. One of them is called Say Hey, which happens quarterly, where they do a lot of networking opportunities for people who have just moved to the region. And the focus for them really is on professionals of color, right? So it's people who have advanced degrees, lawyers, doctors, professors, accountants, things like that. So the idea is that they're providing sort of community building and networking for people who are just moving here, ideally, and providing sort of a space for them. And they have opportunities for local organizations to learn about how to manage their diversity and inclusion goals as well. So one of the things that they do on occasion is try and do research to, just get some data behind some of the things that they are focused on. So overall, they're an organization that tries to recruit and retain professionals of color here in the region. And what they were coming up against is this sort of anecdotal evidence that shows that professionals of color have sort of this pattern where they come for a couple of years, but then they leave, and it's really hard to keep people here. There's also, right, like I mentioned already, the reality of what the demographics are, and the reality that replacing employees is really costly. It takes a lot of time. It's really bad for morale. And they sort of knew these things. This pattern was sort of something that they had a lot of anecdotal evidence for, but they wanted to have something a little bit more rigorous. So they put out a call for proposals. I responded and was chosen to do what we ended up doing was a mixed method study that included both qualitative interviews with professionals of color who have experience living in the region, and then we followed that up with a survey, a larger scale survey of almost 300 survey responders to sort of provide another angle of looking at the phenomena that we were getting from the interviews, right? So a lot of what I'm presenting is, in this first part, is a mixture of quotes that are coming from the interviews and some quantitative data that we got from the surveys as well. So the methodology for the surveys, we had 75% women, and the racial background was majority, well, 42% Black or African American, 20%, give or take, biracial, 20% Asian, 15% Hispanic. So a pretty good representation across the board. And we had a lot of help from Partners in Diversity in getting connected with both interviewees and potential survey responders, right? They have a listserv that goes out. So we're really indebted to them to getting access to the sample that we got. In terms of the types of people that responded, most people came here. Most people were not from here, from Portland. Most people came for a job or they came for other sort of personal reasons. And we had a lot of good representation in terms of different ranks, right? Associates, managers, assistant directors in the pool. About half of them were also in supervisory positions. So this gives you a little bit of an understanding of the types of people that we were talking to and getting information from. So the data, the way that we presented it to stakeholders was sort of things that are happening in the workplace and the things that are happening outside of work, right? Because one of the main questions is like, what can organizations do to help recruit and retain people in the region? So with respect to workplace experiences, if this is a really simplified way of looking at this, but if you break it down into sort of like those who agreed versus kind of didn't agree with the questions that we had, about 75% reported some form of workplace discrimination that they have experienced while working in the Portland area. 70% reported experiencing some work-related strain. And then only 17% agreed or strongly agreed that their organization was supportive of DEI initiatives. And only about 30% agreed or strongly agreed that they were satisfied with the jobs. So these are pretty low numbers with respect to, if we compare this to other sort of normal demographic groups. And as bad as those numbers are, it's a little bit, or we can see what this looks like with some of the quotes. So some people said things like, I was accosted at work by a coworker who was associated with the Proud Boys. With no witnesses, he is still employed and very much involved with groups aligned with white supremacy. Another person said the work environment acts as a filtering system for professionals of color. Even if we get the job, then the environment is so uncomfortable that culture itself acts as a filter. And another person said, I experience racism and microaggressions on a near daily basis. And it's important to remember to clarify that these are representative quotes. These aren't like the cherry-picked most extreme quotes, right? Some people had very harsh things to say in all caps and, and using sort of profanity as well. So some people were really passionate about this. So the numbers with respect to experiences outside of work, so just in the community, are actually a little bit worse. So 97% of respondents reported some form of discrimination that they experienced just sort of living in the Portland area. 96% reported that people consider themselves in Portland to be more tolerant than they actually are in reality. And this is something that I'm going to expand on quite a bit later. And then only 1% agreed or strongly agreed that they felt included in the community. And I think that this is a good point to at which to point out that these data were collected in the summer of 2019. So this is before COVID, it's before the racial reckoning and the protests with respect to police brutality. So, these numbers are sort of a baseline you could think of as before 2020, right? What were the experiences like? So some quotes with respect to what's happening in the community. Some people said things like, what I did not expect is the hypocrisy of the Oregon residents claiming to be liberal, but only to cover up the toxic racism that is embedded in the culture. I've lived in different areas across the US, and I've never experienced racism like I did when I lived in Oregon. Racism is the number one reason why I moved. Another person sort of similarly said, I had heard of this liberal, creative, progressive climate and found that to be true on the surface, but the decision-making apparatus underlying that veneer was extremely conservative. So what we're seeing is this idea of like, Portland kind of has this reputation and this expectation for being progressive and liberal, and it does seem to be that way for a while, but that there's the word veneer, I think, was something that we sort of adopted in the way that we talk about this phenomenon a bit. So that's kind of the idea, and like I said, I'm going to dig into this a little bit more a little bit later, but that juxtaposition is something that came through really, really strongly in terms of people's expectations versus what their experiences were. Back into a workplace sort of context with respect to tokenism, so the idea that you feel like you're the only person like you. So 70% of respondents reported some sort of tokenization at work. 75% reported being expected to speak on behalf of their racial or ethnic group, right? It's like, so you're one of them, so what do you think we should do with respect to this? Almost 90% reported feeling that they stood out because of their race and ethnicity, and 64% reported serving on committees and activities as a representative of their racial ethnic group, right? So we see this a lot, and that, of course, has an extra burden on people with respect to quotes. One person said, I feel as if I were misled. I'm the only female of color at an office of over 200. I don't see anyone like me for weeks at a time. It has created an anxiety and depression problem. I feel lonely. Mentally, I am worse off than when I arrived. Another person said, people want you there, but they want you to do things the white way and not infuse your own cultural values or perspectives. So one thing that's interesting about tokenism is that it creates a situation where people are sort of at the same time invisible, but also like very, very highly visible at the same time, right? So you kind of stand out, but then when you have something that you want to say or you have an initiative that you want to push forward, then suddenly you don't count as much. Your voice isn't heard as loudly. With respect to accountability for DE and I efforts in workplace contexts, so 83% reported feeling like they had to work harder than their white counterparts. Only 12% agreed or strongly agreed that their organization has a diversity-friendly work environment, and 9% agreed or strongly agreed that the organization puts a lot of time and money into diversity initiatives. So again, this is 2019. We might expect that these sort of organizational level things have improved since then, but that's when the data were collected, so just keep that in mind. And then with respect to DEI, some people said things like, leadership talks the talk, but never walks the walk on investing in diversity and inclusion. Many people are hostile toward DEI initiatives behind closed doors. Another person said, I was devastated when I learned how much lower my salary was than other Caucasian employees with less experience and poorer job performance. And another person said, I get a lot of feedback that my performance is very good, but I cannot get promoted. I've been there for 2.5 years with others who are in higher positions with the same or less experience. And at this rate, I'm considering getting as much experience as I can and leaving the company. So again, the idea behind all of this work was, we're sort of starting from the place of why are people leaving? We see people are leaving. We see the demographics. What's the explanation? So here's, we're kind of coming from a position of strength. We're not creating a situation, right? We're sort of trying to understand and describe what the situation is like. So anything where they talk about reasons for why I'm leaving, that's something that we really were interested in. Another thing, so moving back to the community sort of space, just asking about the community, what it's like living in the community. So only 6% of respondents felt that there were appropriate cultural resources in the community. 5% felt that there were appropriate dating opportunities. 4% felt that there were spaces to connect with other people, and only 16% agreed or strongly agreed that they felt comfortable in restaurants, stores, and public places. So again, the numbers for community are much more negative than they are for workplace types of experiences. So that's kind of a silver lining for people who are HR and DEI experts here in the region. Some quotes like this. One person said, as a Black woman, it's impossible to live here, and it's almost impossible to date here. It seems like a personal issue, but it becomes a professional one if I can't socialize with my coworkers or even want to stay at my job when I can have no personal life. It affects retention drastically. Every single Black woman recruited has left, except the one who came here with a partner. So we got a little bit of pushback from people saying, like, well, who cares if they can date? And this is, sort of giving legitimacy to the idea that, like, if you can't live here and you can't have a partner here, then you can't you can't work here. Another person says there are hardly any Black social or cultural spaces, no Black nightclubs, not many Black restaurants. I haven't found anyone I would consider to be a best friend. So while I'm content with my job here, I will eventually leave because my non-work life is not enjoyable. And there was this sense of, sort of this um, something we might call like Portland nice. And Portland nice isn't unique to Portland. They have other sort of like euphemisms for that in other parts of the country. But this idea that people, they'll say like, let's hang out or let's do this or something like that. And then it never sort of like turns into a real genuine connection, right? Sort of surface connections. So people weren't really used to that. So in terms of recommendations for organizational leaders, again, we're still kind of in the more applied portion of the presentation. So we asked people, what do you think, would be useful for organizations to do in order to retain people? So one thing that people said was, creating policies that use an equity lens, being participatory and making sure that there's an understanding of how organizational and community, policies impact the people that they're intended to impact, so thinking about different groups and how those different groups are impacted by different policies. That's what using an equity lens means. Another one is improving the culture and the climate of the organization. So this is something that my lab has really focused on. All the work that we do with respect to understanding the experiences of people who are marginalized sort of leads naturally into a focus on allyship and a focus on improving culture and climate within organizations. So you don't want to bring people in to an organization if the culture and the climate isn't ready to accept those people into it, right? So that's just going to perpetuate this revolving door. So getting the culture and climate ready first and then doing a lot of recruitment of new types of people is the correct order of operations. Another one that sounds sort of pedantic, but I think is really, really important is not being defensive. A lot of the stories that we heard from people was basically like, I had something, really negative happen to me. I went to HR or I went to my supervisor. They listened to me, but then nothing ever happened. And or they kind of blamed me for being too sensitive, or they accused me of being racist, or they just sort of weren't able to listen to the fact that they or somebody at the organization had done or said something that could be considered to be offensive by other people. So I think coming in with an orientation that's not defensive and just has this sort of like quality about it that's open to thinking that other people might have interpreted the thing that you did or the thing that you said in a way that you didn't intend is really a good step forward, right? So it doesn't shut down the conversation. Relatedly, taking initiatives to learn, a lot of people had expressed some frustration that they felt like their white colleagues were sort of asking them a lot of questions about what's it like being Black, or how do I be a good ally, or something like that. And they kind of felt like you need to learn that on your own. I'm not here to sort of teach you how to do these things. And I think since 2020, there's been a lot of personal and sort of um, like systematic initiatives to be better as a community with respect to that. Another one that I think is really powerful is hiring and promoting professionals of color into leadership roles. So a lot of people said that when they went up the chain in terms of the hierarchies of their organizations, it was like people didn't understand their experiences because they didn't have the same experiences. So having people who kind of have that lived experience and understand how these things can play out, I think is really powerful. And then pay transparency just sort of came out as its own sort of recommendation. It was pretty clear that people wanted to have a better understanding of what people were getting paid so they could make sure that they're not getting paid unfairly for the performance that they were doing. So this is the end of the more applied sort of stakeholder portion. So I'm going to pause and just see what questions there might be. And I actually can't see about the questions, so I'm going to pull this.
Let's see, don't see questions in the chat, but I think what I would, I think we can, if you have a question, please unmute and just share your question, or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, I'll repeat it. But while, if anybody does have a question while they are thinking about that, Larry, I actually wanted to, and I don't know if this is the the right, or if there's time to describe this, but I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about the allyship training, which is sort of a kind of a response to some of this that you have developed. And I don't know if you can just share briefly what that is so that people, I would like to know a little bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the allyship training is, again, it's sort of the culmination of a lot of different projects that we've been doing, including this one. When I started my dissertation work, it was really focused on like, okay, we see that coworker support is really important in these relationships for people who have marginalized identities in terms of job satisfaction and commitment and lower turnover and lower strain. So we wanted to understand like what can coworkers be doing. And that was sort of the rationale. The training itself, it's a mixture of lecture, sort of traditional, this type of, sort of engagement. But we also include a bit of sort of the socio-historical perspective of why allyship works and why it's important. We include some of the research findings that we've done in our lab and other labs in IO psychology that sort of justifies from a scientific perspective why allyship matters and how it can be useful. And then we go into the actual training, which is basically, it focuses a lot on what types of strategies people can engage in, particularly when there's some sort of like thing that happens. If there's something that is prejudicial that's said, or there's an environment that's being created, or there's a certain person that needs to sort of be corrected a bit. It's like, how do you do that? How do you address those situations? What words do you say? How do you say them? With what cadence? With what sort of words? And we give people lots of different options. So there are videos that show the different sort of examples of like how you might engage in those types of, we call them confrontation behaviors, which sounds more confrontational than it actually is. But the idea is that you're addressing some sort of hostile thing that's happened or that's happening. So we train people on how to do that. It's based really strongly on the social psychology, the bystander intervention literature. But it's not just sort of disagreeing. There's lots of different nuanced, different ways of, the idea is you find the strategy that might make sense for you, that is most comfortable for you. So we train people on how to do those things, and then we have them actually interact with each other in a relatively safe environment where one person's kind of given a script to do or say something that's kind of racist or prejudicial, and the other person, having sort of seen these examples, has to respond. And the idea is that what we found in some of the early work that we did was that people are really good at understanding when they should say something, but they don't know what to say, and they are afraid of eliciting backlash, and they're afraid of making things worse. So we're really focused on addressing those two components, increasing the knowledge and increasing the confidence by doing this in a safe environment. So philosophically, that's the idea, and we've had some pretty good results with the pilot data that we've collected so far.
That's great. That was actually a bigger dose than I've ever gotten. That's fantastic. So it's sort of not to simplify, but it's a combination of social support and bystander kind of training, so that people know how to interact with their peers, but also how to respond if something is inappropriate in the environment, and be an ally there and increase those behaviors. So, wow.
Yeah, and it's really designed to get at climate and culture. So even just having the conversation about like we as a group, as a work group, are gonna we're gonna be comfortable addressing this when it happens. That's a big step forward, I think.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to see if there are any other questions. If anybody, I don't see anything in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute, and I can't see hands. So, oh, I do see a hand from Anjali, but I only see a few people. Anjali, go ahead.
Thanks, Leslie, and thank you, Larry. It's been really interesting to hear kind of your qualitative part of the study, and to hear what people think about it, their experiences as professionals in Portland. I was wondering, were there also positive experiences that were shared that we could perhaps build on moving forward?
Yeah, the positive experiences were really centered on like my organization does a good job of this. Or like I have a certain supervisor, or I had a mentor or an ally that like really was influential in my career. So it's kind of like pockets of things. You know, some people didn't have a lot of positive things to say, but some people were able to identify like, well, at this one job, they did a really good job of this. And we'll see in the next part of the presentation how that kind of buffers some of these negative things that we're seeing.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, I have another question, but I can wait until someone else is asked.
Are there any other questions? Anjali, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So my other question is, were there differences among kind of perspectives across industries?
We did look at industry and we didn't find any differences. Nothing that made any sort of sense, right? And the industries were really stratified and the sample size wasn't super big. So sometimes you only have a few people in each industry, but we did look at that and we didn't see anything systematic. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can move forward. Let me see if I can get this back. Is this correct now?
Yep, that's up.
Okay, awesome. So the part that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into is this idea of psychological licensing. And what this is this notion of this discrepancy between I expected Portland to be liberal, progressive, sort of post-racial, everybody's an ally, Black Lives Matter signs everywhere, but then my experience is not that. So it's trying to explain and understand like, well, why is there that dissonance, that difference in between what the expectation was and what the experience is? So psychological licensing is something that comes from the social psychology literature. It's pretty well known, and it's interesting because it's a direct contrast to the much larger literature on consistency and cognitive dissonance reduction. So in general, we think, you know, people like being consistent, and if there's an inconsistency, we work to negate and sort of reduce that inconsistency. We don't like saying one thing and then doing another. So in general, that is true, but there are certain situations where sort of the opposite is true. So the idea with psychological licensing is that you can engage in pro-social behaviors that sort of provide you license or give you credentials or give you credits that then allow people to subsequently engage in antisocial types of behaviors without fearing that they're going to compromise themselves because they've already established that they're good people, right? So the sort of classic example of this is like somebody might say something like, well, I'm not racist, but, and then they say something kind of racist. So that's a very simplified version, but that kind of gives you the idea. In the literature, there's also this distinction between moral credits. So the idea is like, if I do 5 good things, then I can do 5 bad things, and I can sort of wind up at this neutral space. And then moral credentials, which is this idea that like, if I just do a bunch of good things, then I'll create a reputation for myself as being a good person, and then I can do a few bad things and it won't hurt my reputation. So it doesn't really matter if it's a one-for-one sort of thing in the way that we're conceptualizing it, but I think the moral credentials makes a little bit more sense. And this has been documented in the research with respect to things like racial discrimination, like in the example that I provided, but also dieting, right? So it's like, oh, I worked out today, or like I was really good at my diet yesterday, so I can now have a treat or something like that. Consumerism, I, did something that was, I contributed to, a fundraiser, or I gave money, so then I should be able to buy something for myself. Goal pursuit, I worked really hard yesterday, so I can kind of be lazy today. Eco-friendly behaviors, I recycle, so it's okay if I, leave the light on every now and then. So that type of thing. We see most of the research is on racism. So licensing for racism can be elicited even just by disagreeing with racist statements. So if you say like, well, I don't really agree with that, then later when you're put in a situation, it's more likely that you'll do something that sort of is a little bit racist. Saying that you voted for Barack Obama, reflecting on past experiences where you got along with racial minorities, being led to believe that you're making progress on being anti-racist, or simply just refusing to engage in racist behaviors can all sort of ironically lead to more subsequent racist behaviors because you've engaged in this sort of licensing behavior. And these studies that I'm referencing here are, again, from social psychology, mostly like lab-based studies. So you come into a lab, you're put into a situation that's been contrived by the experimenter, and then they watch your behavior later on. Okay, so it's very controlled, but a bit, hypothetical in nature. What's interesting also is that psychological licensing can be motivated both by internal and external pressures to appear non-racist. So it could be like, well, I don't consider myself to be racist, so I'm going to engage in this type of behavior. Or I don't want other people to think that I'm racist, so I'm going to engage in this behavior. So they both work, but it seems like it's more likely to be, it's a stronger effect when you're watched by other people. So if you're being observed, the effect is a lot stronger. So the external influence seems to be a bit stronger than the internal influence. And what's interesting too is that licensing seems to be more successful in the eyes of other people that are like you. So it might not be surprising to know that if somebody's engaging in some sort of like a licensing behavior where they're talking about how they're non-racist, other people who are in the majority group, so white people would say like, oh yeah, like I agree, like you do really sound non-racist, whereas a Black or a brown person might hear those sort of things and sort of maybe correctly believe that they're putting on a show, they're being performative, they're saying this in order to try and establish themselves as being non-racist, maybe because they are secretly racist, right? So there's been a couple studies that have looked at this where they basically find that white participants were more convinced by anti-racist licensing behaviors than Black participants, and similarly with gay, straight sort of comparisons. Like the idea is that people can kind of see through these licensing behaviors if they don't belong to the majority group that's sort of perpetuating this thing. Okay, this is all kind of background information to give context to what we're thinking in terms of this. The last part of the puzzle is that you can also engage in, you can experience the benefits of licensing, of moral licensing and psychological licensing, even by just watching other people in your group engage in pro-social behavior. So you don't actually have to be the one doing the pro-social thing, but if you're in the same group and you identify with that group and somebody in your group does a good thing, then that sort of, you can sort of bask in that reflected glory and take on that license for yourself, right? So as one example, participants made less healthy food choices after learning that somebody similar to them had made healthy choices for their eating. So you can transfer over to somebody else. So that got us thinking, right, that, who are the relevant others? It could be organizational coworkers, it could be family members, it could be cultural groups. And what we're doing with these data is thinking about what would it look like if we considered psychological licensing on a community-wide scale. And again, we're sort of using the backdrop of Portland as having a reputation for being liberal, progressive, anti-racist, everybody's an ally here, to the extent that people in Portland might be all sort of ascribing to that notion, that could be providing license to people here as a community as a whole, which is contributing to this idea that nothing's wrong here, we don't need to do anything. But then the people that are experiencing these negative things are seeing through it, and they're feeling this, again, this juxtaposition. So this sort of explains why there could be this dissonance between people's expectations and the way that people talk about themselves in Portland and the way that people are treated who have different identities. So what we did in terms of the data, we again went at this with both qualitative and quantitative, the data that we had. So we used basically grounded theory approach. We kind of had an idea of what we were looking for, but we let the data speak for themselves. We used an iterative process. We went back where we looked at the literature and we looked at the quotes and we looked at the literature again. And that's how we kind of came up with the psychological licensing idea, something that fits really well theoretically with what we're being told. We also made sure that we were participatory in terms of, we asked people about our themes as we were deriving them. We got people that we had interviewed. We got people from Partners in Diversity. They are authors on the paper that we're writing, so they're really active in terms of making sure that we're reflecting exactly what we were told. Again, we used purposive sampling. We had the listservs from Partners in Diversity, and we had people that were on the coding team that weren't interviewers as well, so they were kind of able to play devil's advocate, and they were good about challenging us when we said, here's what we think it is, and then they could look at it and say like, well, you might be too close to this. This is what I think it actually says, right? So that's the idea with respect to best practices with qualitative data analysis. This is a bit busy, but the idea is that we did put things into a traditional Goya data structure, and this is the same information but put into a process model. So the idea here is that we have sort of three main things going on. So on the left, we have an image violation, and an image violation is this dissonance that we're talking about. This, I expected one thing, that's my image, that is not what I experienced, that's the violation, right? So we called this community facade, which is this idea of, I'm expecting this really, really nice progressive environment, and I'm experiencing this facade, right? It doesn't feel real, it's a veneer. We almost use the word veneer, but facade seems to work just as well. That leads to this withdrawal trajectory. Okay, so this is, again, the idea is trying to predict turnover. And what we saw in the data was that people were talking about not feeling like they belong, right? So I feel like there's this juxtaposition between what I expected and what I'm experiencing. That makes me feel like I don't belong here. That makes me feel psychological strain, and in some cases, physical strain as well. So people talked about health ailments and mental health ailments as well. And then, right, theoretically, we know that link between strain and belongingness is really strong with turnover. So that's sort of the theoretical endpoint. But we also saw, like Anjali asked about, what are the positive things? And we were able to identify the inclusion climate within the organizations and a general sense that the organization was supportive of them and their identities and DEI. So we modeled those theoretically as buffers, right, between this lack of belongingness and strain that should prevent you from feeling the strain that you feel from not feeling like you belong in Portland or at your workplace. So in terms of, we had to create a new scale. This was a new idea, this community facade sort of items. So one example, I feel like people in the Oregon, Southwest Washington area are less racially tolerant than they consider themselves. They're more woke than they actually are. They're more progressive than they actually are, that type of thing, right? So we came up with about 7 items to capture what this idea is. The reliabilities were good. We also measured directly in the survey sense of belonging, organizational strain, inclusion climate, and perceived organizational support. So again, from the qualitative data, we were able to identify what sort of constructs we wanted to try and capture in the survey data. And if we go back to our theoretical model and we throw everything into a structural equation model to see how these things are related to each other, the overall model is good with good fit indices. So we're confident that we're measuring things the right way. And then in terms of the process of how these things relate to one another, we also see that that is significant. And this moderation model, with when you put these things in, that's a significant moderation effect as well for both of these different buffers. So we can see this a little bit more. We can see here that the relationship between belonging and strain is much stronger if the inclusion climate is poor. Okay, so if you don't feel that the inclusion climate is good, then that you're going to experience more strain as a result of not feeling like you belong. And then similar, the same pattern with lower organizational support. We get an exacerbated effect among participants who reported a lower level of organizational support. So we see this buffering effect in the relationship between stress and strain. You'll also notice that I took turnover out. We did measure turnover intentions, but that didn't come through in the data. So we pulled it out of the model and are just kind of relying on the theoretical basis that strain and lack of belonging are related to turnover. And I think the reason for turnover not working is that we had a mixture of people who had already left the Portland area and people who were still in Portland. So in that context, we're kind of asking about turnover in two different ways. Like, how was this related to, or like, how much did you want to leave for the people who had already left? And then how much do you want to leave for the people who haven't left yet? So I think the measurement just kind of got screwed up with that based on the sample that we had. So I think that's okay. But the implications of this is, I think, what we're thinking is that we're identifying psychological licensing potentially on a community level. So we would be the first ones to conceptualize it that way. And we're, again, leveraging this idea of, Portland's reputation of being progressive might actually have an ironically negative effect in how people are experiencing, because it's like, oh, there's no problem here, we're all allies. And then when there is a problem, people get shut down and conversations don't progress, and there's no progress that sort of happens with respect to these types of things. With respect to the theory, this again sort of shows the importance of not just what's happening at work, but also the work-life balance considerations. So we see now here, it's not the family that is problematic, but just people's experiences in the community. So sort of thinking about work-life balance, not just as like work family, but like work life, like what are your community experiences, and centering those as well. And when we think about workplace outcomes, and then also, the positive thing is that we did see that organizations can have a positive impact, right? So I have bad experiences in my community, but my organization is really great. So, that makes things a lot better. One thing that I think is an interesting question is whether this is generalizable to other communities. When we go to publish this, we run the risk of, this being like, well, this is just Portland and it doesn't operate the same way in other places. But one thing that I was looking at is that if you look at the demographics of, you think about like, well, what's another city that's similar to Portland? And a lot of people think Austin, right? So keep Portland weird, keep Austin weird, same type of vibe, generally. And what's interesting about Austin is that when you look at the demographic characteristics of Austin compared to Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Amarillo, the other, sort of big cities in Texas, the demographics of Austin are much closer to the demographics of Portland, whereas the demographics in the other cities in Texas are much, 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 much more racially diverse. So it sort of lends itself to the idea that the same type of thing might be happening in Austin, potentially as a result of, again, this like keep Austin weird, Austin's progressive, Austin is the liberal bastion in Texas, but then why is the demographic data not aligned with that, right? So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions that are left. The full report is available online for Partners in Diversity, and the academic data they've been submitted to a journal and they got rejected, but we're going to submit them again somewhere else.
Larry, can you put the link to the full report, and would you be comfortable putting that in the chat?
Yeah.
That I definitely would like to, dive in with that. There, right now, there's one question in the chat from Peter Spencer, and it has to do with this kind of Portland-centric issue. And he mentions that the 4 largest Portland employers with OHSU among them are health services employers. Given the Portland-centric focus of the study, should we conclude, this is his question, your 2019 findings in all probability apply to Portland's major health service providers, including OHSU? So that's a question. And then he asks if you conducted any OHSU specific analyses.
So the answer to the first question is probably. I don't think we have any reason to believe that OHSU would be immune from this type of thing. It could be that, and the thing that's important to realize is that a lot of the main effects with respect to what's pushing people out of Portland is not the organization. So OHSU could very well be one of those organizations that is doing a really good job and has, you know, these buffering effects in place for their employees. But the larger sort of issue is, again, the community sort of experiences. So it's like, there's only so much that any one organization can do. So we didn't do OHSU specific analyses either. So that's sort of an open question, but I think the larger phenomena would probably apply to OHSU just as well.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open it up for other questions.
And I just tried the link and it looks like Partners in Diversity took the report down from their website recently. So I'll Hunter, I think I have a PDF of it from somewhere, so I'll look for that.
Thank you, that'd be great. Thanks so much. I think David, did you have a question? David?
Yes, thank you, Larry, for your presentation. Can you speak a little bit of that intersection between gender and race? Because, you know, Portland, historically speaking, may be more liberal in terms of gender-based rights than racial-based diversity. So can you speak a little bit of how different type of discriminations came across in your data?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think one of the things that's unique about Portland is that it is very, like you said, with respect to gender, but also with respect to gender identity, like non-binary and trans identities, and sexual orientation. So Portland is really, really, really inclusive with respect to those types of identities. And people use that as sort of a heuristic of like, well, if they're fine with that, then they must be fine with race as well. And then that's not the case. So that's, I think, part of what's a little bit surprising. With respect to gender differences in the data, we looked at that and we didn't find any sort of systematic differences based on men versus women in the way that people were responding to our survey and to our interview questions. Having said that, though, I'm part of another project that's sort of similar to this one at PSU. It's an NSF Advanced project where we're looking at faculty of color in STEM fields and women in STEM fields. And what we're finding there, like faculty, right? What we're finding there is that there seems to be a really strong gender effect that exacerbates the race effect. So I think that there are issues that, you know, men of color sort of talk about, faculty of color that are men talk about, that are unique to race, but then women of color, faculty that are women of color have much, much, much more problematic experiences. So I think that there is probably an effect of race and gender that is exacerbated for women of color, but we didn't find that in the data for this project. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions for Larry? I'll just mention that I think it was just last week, a number of us attended an OHSU sponsored listening session put on. It was kind of sponsored by the Wellbeing Collaborative, but it was, I think it was actually put on by the Relate Lab, which was a listening session for faculty and staff and students to attend, and they presented 2 different videos of interviews with people of color and their experiences at OHSU. And they were moving. They were so moving and extremely consistent with what you're finding, Larry, what you're sharing. And I think for, you know, on the face of it, right, you think this whole the whole psychological licensing, like, aren't we supposed to be progressive here? And then you hear these experiences and then these experiences of people at OHSU and your workplace and the professionals here. I mean, I think you might be able to actually access those because I think they would be of interest to you. But it's quite consistent with your research findings, and it was very impactful.
Yeah, and I think what I like about this project again is this notion that, like, you know, if you submit it to a journal, and it's really easy to be like, you're just kind of making this up, you know, but then we're starting with the reality of, like, well, these are the demographic, these are the reality of what, you know, is happening here. So it's a bit descriptive in nature, which I think it can be good and bad in terms of journal publications. But I think what I want to do also, since we have a little bit of time, is just acknowledge I'm lucky to have a lot of my co-authors here. So, like, Anna Kelly, Nicholas Smith, Jennifer Saucedo, we're all really, really, and, you know, still very much a part of the data collection, the community engaged partnership, the interpretation of the findings, identifying psychological licensing as a mechanism. So if any of y'all have anything to add, or if I missed something, or you know, open invitation for y'all, and acknowledgement also for y'all's help on this work.
Anything else from co-authors or non-co-authors? Well, I'll go ahead and close us out. And thank you so much, Larry. This was excellent. It was fascinating and such a critically important topic, and something we need to hear again and again and again. So thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing and the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and especially those of you tuning in from the conference. It's really nice.